happy to be here, sharing space at A-State, where I am also a student working on PhD in heritage studies. So it's a really great way to be able to end the Arkansas Folklife series, and we're also working with a series at A-State called Talking About Heritage, which is really neat. I actually helped edit parts of this volume with the authors and editors as a graduate student, so I'm really happy to be able to share it with a larger audience. So first, I'll just introduce the book, and then I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of the guest speakers before I turn it back over to Gregory and let him take it away. And unless you have a different order you plan to go in. So Intangible Cultural Heritage has recently grown as an analytical construct for documenting and interpreting culture, and as a canonical term to support official concepts of heritage. ICH is how we abbreviate it, is compelling scholars to explore its multiple forms of expressive culture, and has become codified through UNESCO, specifically within the 2003 Convention for Safeguarding of ICH. So this volume explores case studies from Gabon, India, Mozambique, Sri Lanka, and the USA to represent diverse positionalities and voices articulating complexities, ambiguities, and uncertainties within heritage discourses. Each of the editors is also the author of a chapter. And they're also great. Shihan de Silva, Jayasuriya. Did I do that? Did I do that okay? Sorry if I mispronounced. Is a visiting professor at Ritsumeikan University, Japan, a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge, and senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in the School of Advanced Study of the University of London. She is a member of ICOMOS, I think, Sri Lanka, and is the author of 6 books, including The Portuguese in the East, A Cultural History of a Maritime Trading Empire, and the African Diaspora in Asian Trade Routes and Cultural Memories. We also have Mariana, Pinto, Leitão, I'm so sorry, Pereira. I'm horrible at pronouncing names. Is a PhD candidate at the Cambridge Heritage Research Center at the University of Cambridge, researching how diaspora communities negotiate identity through cultural heritage. She worked as an archaeologist and heritage expert in Macau, and is a member of ICOMOS, Portugal. Her publications include the Macanese in contrast, Remembrance and Diaspora Homecomings. And we also have Gregory Hansen, who is a professor of folklore and English at Arkansas State University, where he also teaches in the Heritage Studies doctoral program. He's worked with as a public folklorist for a range of organizations across the U.S., and his scholarship focuses on applied cultural work and roots music. His publications include Florida Fiddler, The Life and Times of Richard Seaman. So thank you guys so much for being here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. It's fun to have this both in person and online and truly global. And I do want to also acknowledge contributions of Faisal Muhammad and Lauren in the editing and proofing and all that. So it's a little bit of a homecoming here. So yeah. And then hi to everybody online, and a big shout out to the Arkansas Folklife program too. We came up with our plan for doing it, and I think we're going to have Shihan talk first about how the project came to be, right?
Okay, so I have to share the screen.
Yeah, we can have you share screen. Lauren's going to come up and get that set up here in a moment.
I got it. Should I?
It's good to be able to see you. The lighting's really nice, Shihan.
Okay, can you share now?
Yes, that's my screen, and now you can see my screen. Is it okay? You can see some slides?
We can
Yes.
see it now. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so yes, so you can see the book now. All right, the cover of the book, designed by Mariana Pereira. And as Gregory, as Lauren has said, there are already 3 co-editors of the book. The book actually was nominated for the Catherine Briggs Award on its rich folkloric content, and you'll see that a lot of the book is on folklore. As I go along, I'll explain. So myself, my main institute is the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and I'm a member of ICOMOS Sri Lanka. And Mariana is a member of ICOMOS Portugal and doing a doctorate at the University of Cambridge. And Gregory is at the Arkansas State University, a professor of folklore. So as UNESCO points out, cultural heritage is not just monuments and collections, as most people would recognize, but it's also traditions, living expressions, oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices, knowledge and skills. So this is something that the book brings through quite well. Apart from a kind of opening up a debate on the division of the dichotomy of tangible and intangible. So the first chapter of the 8 chapters is by Professor Lina Dominelli at the University of Stirling, a professor of social work, who wrote about the protecting our environment, learning lessons from COVID-19. And all these are a selection of papers of a Zoom conference that I convened at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London at the very beginning in 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. And we never expected that we would see the book in print and the pandemic would continue. So we still are in the middle of the pandemic talking about the book. So chapter 2 is by Professor Bilinda Nandadeva, who is the UNESCO representative from Sri Lanka. And he wrote on living culture and sustainable development and the impact of the pandemic on intangible cultural heritage in Sri Lanka. The next chapter is by myself on safeguarding Afro-Sri Lankan intangible cultural heritage. That's followed by my colleague at the University of California in Irvine, Behrouz Shroff, who writes about the intangible cultural heritage of people of African descent in India. And that's followed by Mutiu Shapane at the Eduardo Mondlane University in Mozambique, who writes about the local knowledge as intangible cultural heritage. And he takes the 2 cases of Omba and Majini found in northern Mozambique. And the next chapter is by Gregory Hansen at Arkansas, who writes about bluegrass, performing intangible cultural heritage and fostering historic preservation. The next chapter is by Ritu Sethi, who was actually the chairperson of selecting these items for recognition in the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage list. And she is from India. She's writing about the many shades of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage and its sustainable development in India. The final chapter is by Cheryl Toman at the Alabama University. And she's writing about a Gabonese geographer's Aurora's journey, written by Nadia Origo. And this book was translated into English, and Cheryl was the editor of that book. So you can see that all of us are insiders, perhaps bordering insider-outsider in some cases. So we are talking about real experience. So there are 3 themes in the book: intangible cultural heritage and the COVID pandemic, intangible cultural heritage in performance or as performance, and decolonizing intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. And these 3 themes are held together in a masterly introduction by Mariana Pereira in situating intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. A challenging partnership. She's asking if it's a challenging partnership. And we couldn't conclude because we want to open up debates. And Gregory instead wrote a commentary on resources for resiliency within intangible cultural heritage. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a quick overview of my chapter, which is on Afro-Sri Lankan intangible cultural heritage. And Marie Jacinta, whom you see here, pled to the nation through the Sunday Leader, a newspaper, in 1999. They don't speak English, so the newspaper reported this in translation. And I'm going to quote her. Our poverty is our plight. We have no way of doing anything about it. Our culture is our song and dance. It's the only inheritance left behind by our forefathers. We owe this form of livelihood to our children. Please help us, unquote. So as I wrote this paper, I realized that this community, whom I have known for over 20 years, had more than one heritage, quite clearly an African heritage and also a European, a Portuguese heritage. So I came up with the term of dual heritage for them. And as Laura Jane Smith and Natsuko Akagawa say in their book, heritage is intimately linked with identity. However, a key consequence of heritage is that it creates and recreates a sense of inclusion and exclusion. So it's the opposites. While it's an in-group thing, it also excludes them from everyone else in Sri Lanka. It differentiates them from all other communities. So then there's a problem of defining community, because there are several definitions of a community. And I followed Dr. Tim Curtis, the Secretary of the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage, his definition of a community, which is a network of people whose sense of identity or connectedness emerges from a shared historical relationship that's rooted in the practice and transmission of or engagement with their intangible cultural heritage. And that definition suits this community well. So UNESCO emphasizes that cultural heritage should be allowed to evolve rather than be frozen. And this is something that's happened with this community. They also emphasize the importance of intangible cultural heritage as a mainspring of cultural diversity and a guarantee of sustainable development. So in the next 2 minutes, you're going to see a clip of this community who have now come on to stage. So I asked them to dress up as for the stage, and I rented a whole resort with palm trees, coconut trees you see in the background, and I recorded them because I wanted to compare the emotion in their performance in the village, just for themselves, and the performance in front of others in a more contrived, choreographed way. I hope you are going to hear it properly.
They pray in the Sirambiadya church together with Sinhalese Catholics. Mass is held twice a month by a parish priest. According to oral tradition, their ancestors built the parish church, St. Mary's, in the town of Puttalam. At Easter, they perform their rituals on the altar. Their devotion is unquestionable.
සිංහල කසාද බැඳලා ඉන්නන අපේ දැන් කලවම් වෙලා ඉන්නේ. දැන් සිංහල සමහරලාට බුද්ධ ආගම වෙන්න පුළුවන්. සමහරලාට එයාලත් අපේ පැත්තට එනවා. අග්ගාරෙල්ල දැන් මගේ නෝනා බුද්ධ ආගම කියනකොට මම කතෝලික නම් මගේ පල්ලියෙන් විවාහ වෙනවා නම් එයාලා ඒකට කැමතිලා එහෙම වෙච්චා ඉන්නවා. ගොඩාක් දුරට එහෙම තමයි ඉන්නේ. දෙගොල්ලම කතා බහ කරලා එකම පැත්තකට එකතු වෙලා එහෙම ඉන්නවා. දෙක අපිටත් සතුටක් එයාලටත් සතුටක් සමහරලාට ඒ බුද්ධ ආගමයි අපි ආරම්භ වෙනා නම් අපිට වැඩි හොඳින් ආගම අදහගෙන ඉන්නවා.
දැන් මේ පළාතේ පුත්තලම පළාතේ හුඟක්ම ඉන්නේ කවුද? සිංහල මිනිස්සුද? මුස්ලිම් මිනිස්සුද? දෙමළ මිනිස්සුද? බර්ගර්ස්ලාද?
තම පුත්තලම් පැත්තට ටිකක් වැඩි. අලෝ මේ තමයි ඉන්නේ. මුස්ලිම් පැත්තෙන් චුට්ටක් පුත්තලම් පැත්තට වැඩි. නැත්තම් ඉතින් කලවම ඉන්න දැන් පුත්තලමේ දානෙක් තනෙක් වල කලවම තමයි දෙමළ සිංහල මුස්ලිම්.
දැන් ඉතින් බඳිනකොට වෙන අයව මුස්ලිම් අයවත් බඳිනවා.
නෑ නෑ මුස්ලිම් අය නම් කොහොමත් නෑ. හැබැයි දෙමළ අය සම්බන්ධයි. මුස්ලිම් අය කොහොමත් නෑ.
තමාරි ජසින්තා මේ ප්‍රෙසිඩන්ට් ප්‍රේමදාස ඉන්න කාලේ ඔයගොල්ලෝගේ නැටුම් ගැයුම් ගැන හුඟක් උනන්දුවක් ගත්තා. නේද? ඒක ගැන පොඩ්ඩක් කියන්න. යන්නේ අපි ගියා කොහෙද මේ මයංගනේ. ඒ ගිහිල්ලා ඒ තිබුණා. එයා තමයි මේක අපිව ඉදිරියට පිළිගන්නුවේ අපෙන් තමයි. 1580 ගණන් වල 80 ගණන්. ඔව්. ඒකට සර්ටිෆිකේට් එකක් දුන්නද? ඔව් මට දුන්න සර්ටිෆිකේට් එක. ඒ කණ්ඩායමටම එක සර්ටිෆිකේට් එකයි. ඒ කාලේ හිටියා දාච්චි. ඉසලියත් හිටියා. ඔව්. රෆායලුත් හිටියා. ඔව්.
Yes, so I've recorded a few of their songs, and in order to understand the meaning, which they don't exactly know the exact meaning, though they know the context, I've tried to match it to European standard Portuguese, and that's how I work. So taking, just to give you a few examples of the words, on the left dark blue column are the Sri Lanka Portuguese, the Creolized Portuguese words, which they sing in, and in the middle are the European Portuguese words. So just in conclusion, I'd like to say that, yes, it's the lyrics of the manjas encapsulate the residuals of a critically endangered language, Sri Lanka Portuguese. So the community's cultural sustainability is interlinked with preserving their Portuguese linguistic heritage. And the duality of the performance needs to be recognized. Linguistic preservation is a necessary condition for the preservation of song. But language documentation brings back the colonial goals of self-interest, and the throwback to the community needs to be considered in terms of giving them access to the database of their songs and giving them word lists, etymologies, and grammars with translations in Sinhala, the language that they speak now. And so thank you for your attention, and thank you to Lauren Willett in particular for organizing this event. Sure.
It's I'm really glad that you were able to bring in the video of that, because I've read about the dance, but to see it live, it's got such a beautiful flow, and the dynamism to that is just really exciting. I'd love to see that in person. I can go ahead next, and then Mariana, we have talked about what we're presenting, but we didn't really come up with an order. So what I've decided to do is a photo essay, and I'll go ahead and get into share screen. Gonna have to end your share here. Whoops, did I mess up?
No.
You're sharing this.
Okay, so now we're good.
Yep.
All right. I'm glad that I have a lot of support here with people who have a technical background and more interested in it than I have. All right, so we're good. But what I thought I would do is to do some pullouts of quotes from some of the from all of the writing, and illustrate it with some photographs that I've made. And I've got a description of the photos later on that I can give you of who's in the picture. But I kind of like the imagination you might bring to it of kind of thinking, well, what's this about in the photos? All right. So I'm going to try that approach and see how this works. And I had the assistance in another presentation where I had an assistant read it because I couldn't go online. And so this is kind of fun for me to actually read it, and we'll see how this works. And what I want to do is to look at the idea that there's real specific commentary about heritage in different places from all the writers and that side. But I'm interested in the idea, can we begin to come up with overall themes that can be applied elsewhere? It's kind of an interesting idea of what's particular to the local versus what can be generalized, and maybe what can't be also is kind of an intriguing concept too. So I'll go ahead and get it started. And I also want to say I just had a lot of fun editing this. Shihan and Mariana are just wonderful to work with, and we really had a good time doing it. And it's nice to see the fruition of it. So it was really, and all the writers were great to work with too. It was really a good project. Communities articulate the interlacing of identity and heritage in diverse ways. Shihan, Silva, Jayasuriya. When referring to the environmental cultural heritage, I mean the way in which humans interact with the natural environment and incorporate it in their lives. These interactions can be protective and focus on preserving and sustaining the physical environment and biosphere for both current and future generations of living things. That's Lena Dominelli. Intangible cultural heritage can effectively contribute to social, economic, and environmental development and maintain peace and security as fundamental prerequisites for sustainability. Belinda Nandadeva. That might be familiar, Faisal. I'm mentioning Faisal because he has a background in this kind of meadow milling, and we got to view this together. This is from Nadia Origo's novel, Aurora's Journey, and Cheryl Toman writes about this. But Nadia Origo's novel, Aurora's Journey, is not mere travel writing, but rather a wonderfully ambitious project that combines science and literature into one work in which Origo both speaks up and speaks out. Cheryl Toman's writing. Upon visiting the Mbonge waterfalls in Gabon, Origo's protagonist reflects. She had heard of the beautiful landscapes of the world. She had seen them on postcards and books and on television, but she had never been touched by such beauty brushing on the image of Eden she had carried in her mind. Then she realized that a site like this could be hiding completely undiscovered in another corner of the country, and she exclaimed, I'm sure this is in French, Mon Dieu! What country are we in, leaving the things that nature has so generously offered us in obscurity? Things that could be sustainably exploited if they took care of them. And that's Nadia Origo's writing. As a little aside, that's my wife, Betsy, down at an Indian mound in the Natchez Trace Emerald Mound, which is well worth a visit. I define sustainable development as achievement of material and social progress without damage to the surrounding natural environment. Shihan Mutia. For those on the other side of the world, these are some images close to where we live here in Arkansas. Bluegrass Monday demonstrates the value of thinking of historic preservation as also rooted in the interior of buildings. Creating spaces where people want to enter and feel a sense of belonging, in our case within a bluegrass community, inspires us to think of historic preservation from the inside out. That's Gregory Hansen. I guess you figured that one out. Now that COVID's lifting, we'll have to make a field trip out there. That's a lot of fun. By the way, this band just played on Monday there. Oh. Yeah, yeah. And I showed him the book. He was real happy to be in the book. Yeah. Intangible cultural heritage remains crucial as a vehicle and a resource for people to navigate an uncertain presence and the future. After all, intangible represents the art of the possible. And that's a beautiful quote from Mariana, Pinto, Pereira. I love that phrase, the art of the possible. Okay, I'll give it away. This is Johnny Cash's boyhood home in Dice. I can't resist. And it's a heritage site that our university manages, about 45-minute drive from here. Linking to global culture and transmission of culture through social media has captured the younger generation with infinite possibilities. Beharos Shroff. I'm going to take you down to Mississippi. The community's cultural sustainability is interlinked with preserving their linguistic heritage. Another beautiful quote, Shihan, Silva, Jayasuriya. And these are some photos from a Mississippi mural down there representing their history. I like the language in these. Been there, done that. And a nod internationally. Derry in Ulster is where I made this photo. And this one's in Indianola with the B.B. King Museum, so I wanted to just attribute to a great musician here. The COVID pandemic has thrown into sharp relief how vulnerable intangible cultural heritage and its practitioners to shifts in the socio-political, economic, environmental landscape. There is an urgent need for systematic reform to alleviate the distress and bring about rejuvenation. Me too, Sati. Our own consideration of sustainability needs to recognize and memorialize the loss of lives of those who've developed their creative expressions to mastering the arts, as well as to those who value their contributions. And that was me. Thank you. Here we go. Okay. It's Mariana's turn. So are we going to make you a co-host, or you're ready to go? Like Lauren can help us out. You should be able to share. Okay.
I should be able to share. Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, I believe.
It's morning over here.
It is morning, right? So good morning. Special greetings to Lauren and the Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts for the invitation and the opportunity to be here today. My name is Mariana. I am a PhD candidate at the Cambridge Heritage Research Center, University of Cambridge. And I'm one of the co-editors of the book. So I'm going to share my screen, and you're going to see some of the familiar faces again. But I thought it would be important to round this presentation again, just referring to everyone who was a part of it. And also just kind of introducing a little bit what I'm doing. So, okay, I will, like I said, just really briefly go over the chapters once again, just to remind you of what we're talking about. And then I will go a little bit in depth into my own chapter, where I try to challenge the reader to rethink the relation between intangible heritage and sustainable development. So on August 2020, I was invited as a discussant for a conference that Shihan has mentioned. It was titled Intangible Cultural Heritage and Sustainable Development, organized by the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. Shihan was the driver of this conference, and afterwards she challenged Professor Gregory Hansen and myself to co-edit a volume, inviting the conference speakers to further explore their own topics. The book was released in May of this year and deals with the vulnerability and fragility of sustaining intangible cultural heritage within the COVID-19 pandemic. In short, the book addresses the relationship between ICH and sustainable development. Contributors provide ways to understand how intangible heritage practitioners, communities of interest, and facilitators continued practicing and sustaining heritage, or have reconceptualized their understandings and created new intangible heritage expressions in the context of unexpected yet prolonged shocks. Understanding where ICH sits in the midst of these uncertainties is vital, particularly when we look at sustainable development. We cannot ignore the ongoing massive climate disruptions in different parts of the world. Now, these disruptions flag once again the need for urgent action and the fragile interdependence of human and environmental systems. And quoting from my chapter, if inspired by post-humanist perceptions, then there needs to be reckoning with how human agencies and agencies in and of nature are not just shaped in relation to each other, they are completely entwined. End of quote. So like Shihan has said, and Gregory so beautifully quoted from all of us, thank you. So the book is divided into 3 sections: ICH in the pandemic, in performance, and decolonizing ICH and sustainable development. And I will talk about my introduction in just a little bit. Like Shihan said, the first 2 chapters show what working with ICH looks like during the pandemic, particularly exploring the role of social green workers as active cultural interpreters in the case of Dominelli, and the impact of the pandemic in Sri Lanka by Nandadeva. Chapters 3 to 6 look at intangible cultural heritage in performance and explore ICH as something that is constantly in the making, involving embodied interactions with the materialities and settings that surround us. ICH as performance follows Haldrup and Barinholtz's approach and means the process of making sense of what is in performance. Heritage is understood here as, and I quote, emerging out of the social practices and uses to which people put heritage into, end quote. And the last 2 chapters look at decolonizing intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. We have the notion of decolonization following ICROM and implying difficult conversations and reflections on the meaning of cultural institutions and the need to create room for multiple perspectives, showing the different contexts that determine how we look at objects or themes, end of quote. And so now I'm just going to pick on some of the points I wrote for the introduction of the book, where I rethink the relationship or the partnership, let us call it, between intangible heritage and sustainable development. Now, heritage refers to the many ways we engage with the past in the present. We are talking about heritage as a process, as values, meanings, emotions, and relationships we establish with the elements of the past in our daily livelihoods. How we see the past, how we use it and remember it in imagining and working for the futures we desire. Intangible cultural heritage is a conceptual breakthrough that finally placed communities at the center of the heritage process. ICH is a way people have to mediate cultural and social change through the continual construction and negotiation of identity, place, and memory. It is active, it is performative, as described by Ruggles and Silverman. Because it is dynamic and performative, the notion of change is very much related to intangible heritage. But change does not mean continuity. And this aspect gives intangible heritage enormous potential when looking at sustainable development. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, to sustain revolves around the intention to cause to continue in a certain state for an extended period or without interruption. So this means we have to be a bit careful when we apply the word sustain in relation to both development and in particular to heritage. Just saying we need to sustain intangible heritage avoids acknowledging that some heritage expressions or practices might have to be readapted and even discontinued, given the impact they began having on our environments and on human well-being. Now, ICH places communities and people at its heart, but we can question whether ICH can even be manifested without people. We don't think so, right? But sustainability, in contrast, cannot just be a process of change that satisfies human needs or aspirations. Fox and Aldred laid out a post-human ontology that centers sustainable development and as an ecological potential, independent, but at the same time inclusive, of human capacities. A shift into posthumanism rests upon three main aspects. First, on models of relational understanding, so how our actions affect and are affected. Second, on recognizing that everything is context dependent and contexts are uneven. And third, that human agency or values can no longer be the main axis for action, but nevertheless remain crucial. To be post-human is to redefine one's sense of attachment and connection to a shared world by combining ethical values with the well-being of an enlarged sense of community, which includes one's territorial or environmental interconnections. The argument I put forth in the introduction is that heritage in general must be curated for sustainable development. Okay, it's correct. Even if some heritage practices are deemed relevant for their communities of interest, not all expressions of intangible heritage become sustainable in a world increasingly impacted, for example, by climate change. So this idea of curating heritage for sustainable development opens the space for choice, selection, and ultimately the possibility for intangible heritage to be discontinued and transformed, which I think needs to be taken into consideration when looking at sustainability. I am aware of the dangers of claiming that heritage can be discontinued because it is unsustainable in relation to climate change, and it can lead to abuse of vulnerable communities of practice, further exacerbating exclusion and alienation of minorities, indigenous groups, or migrant communities, so the unrecognized voices. And for this reason, it is vital that the partnership between intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development is guided by rights-based approaches that seek well-being, care, and reparative justice, among others. Sustainability ultimately means to deal with human-propelled change, which requires understanding people and the place of ICH in our humanity. intangible cultural heritage, intrinsically composed by dynamic processes, should become a powerful partner of and for sustainable development by encompassing and allowing change and transition outside of continuity. And this will be my last slide. Quoting Nigel Dudley, if you believe humans can play a role within natural ecosystems, then equally, clearly, some interventions should be capable of accommodation without losing integral values. So I hope this book can be an incentive for us to look into situations where change in intangible heritage is curated in order to align with and allow for sustainable development. Yet it is also respectful and mindful of the role intangible heritage plays for its practitioners and communities of interest. Thank you so much. I will stop sharing.
Stop share.
Yes.
Okay, there we are. Well, thank you. It's fun to see everybody pulling these together and have different perspectives on what we wrote about. So kind of puts a capstone on about 1.5 to 2 years of work here. We can open it up for questions or comments from people. We've been just kind of talking about heritage in these series. So if anybody has any comments for anyone, we'll go ahead and turn it over to our audience here. You want to unmute and introduce yourself? All well and good. I see some familiar faces and friends up online here.
Well, I'll start with a question that that I had, which is about, I guess Mariana and Shihan, you both mentioned that heritage, and especially intangible cultural heritage, is always being created and recreated. And then there's this cycle of change that's happening. And so I was just wondering if you guys wanted to comment a little bit more about that cycle, and just, you know, I'm just looking for responses to start the conversation.
And go first.
Go, Shihan, go. You want me to go first?
Sure.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. So as Shihan also has said, we have faced for quite some time the challenge that intangible heritage was not recognized as an expression of heritage. So usually the attention was on the more material expressions, you know, of our past in the present. And I would say only, you know, 30 years ago that the notion of intangible heritage really come to the forefront and very slowly started challenging our perceptions of heritage, which in the past meant you don't need communities, you just need to preserve, you know, the wall or the building, which on its own is important sometimes. But what intangible heritage said was, no, communities and people, we're all, you know, carriers and practitioners of a heritage, regardless of whether it is recognized or not, right? And so that means if we look at our everyday lives, we change all the time. We are continually and constantly remaking, reevaluating the relationship we have, you know, with our food, with the music we perform, with the dance, with the traditions, with our religion, with our family. I mean, this can take up a lot of very different expressions. But this perception that heritage, intangible heritage, should not be viewed, for example, based on authenticity was really big, you know, because there is no authentic heritage. What we do have is different values and different ways of practicing. And so intangible heritage created an entire new way of talking about how we relate to things around us. So for example, if you notice, we don't really use the word protection so much. We use more the word safeguarding, because it accommodates the fact that things do change. They have to change. The question is, how do we manage? And which change are we not willing to accommodate? And, you know, and why are we not willing to accommodate that? And so I guess what we are trying to say is precisely that we need to start engaging in a lot of conversations, some of them quite difficult conversations about what are we able to sustain, what we should not continue, what is hurting the communities, but at the same time, the communities might think it's indispensable for them, but it's damaging the environment. How do we do this? And I think accepting this perception of change is important so that we can start dialogue about what exactly are we supposed to sustain, what do the communities desire, and how are we going to move ahead in a world that's drastically changing, especially with climate change and with all of these political and geopolitical upheavals that we are facing. I believe the concept of continuity needs to be challenged. And at the center we need to accept that things will transform, whether we like it or not. So I would say that this is a little bit the starting point, but I mean, there are very, very different opinions about this. And so I do think some people will find it quite challenging what I'm saying. So I'm definitely open to discussion about this. But yeah, I guess I'll pass it on also to Gregory and Shihan if they want to say anything.
I just want to add that, yes, people do appreciate material things like the Parthenon or broken down pillars, but then who taught them the value of those ruins? So the knowledge transfer, the intangibility is not recognized. And I think Laura Jane Smith makes it quite strongly that all heritage is intangible. And I think that's quite a dramatic change for people like historians, archaeologists, architects who are coming into places like ICOMOS to understand, to bring in artists, as Gregory has been trying to do with folklore. And I think there should be more musicians, dancers getting involved in this heritage, bringing in the softness. So the heritage field needs to be softened by those people. And it's certainly not a museum piece. It's not frozen. It's an evolving thing. And as communities, diasporas move on, they have to adapt their performances. They have to adapt them for the economic needs of that community and the political pressures that are on them. So there are various external factors like cultural tourism that impinges on them. How do they respond to those? And how do they keep to their traditions? And as I've looked, the community, I've looked the two ways of performing, the in-group performance and the performance on stage, that varies. So I think that's all I want to say.
Yeah, I think that idea of looking at heritage as a dynamic process and performance makes it dynamic and gets you away from kind of a fossilized view of heritage that has to be kept the same in that time period. And just in listening to the discussion, thinking about that, I think some of that idea of preserving heritage is coming from a maybe overemphasis on the economic aspects of this, especially in terms of developing tourism or consumption. So you have to kind of bring into the idea of what sort of economic and political supports you can have for it. But I think one of the reminders in the humanities and social sciences is that there's more than that. And the idea is I think we need to kind of move away from just kind of cost effectiveness in this. And when you're looking at that approach, then you're seeing that the idea of sort of preserving a static heritage isn't very viable, because that's just not the way people are interacting. So I think, again, to reiterate the importance of the performative and the processual aspects of heritage, and then kind of thinking how that relates to some of the arguments we have for economic development is something worth considering here.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. What I hear from all of you is how important community is, and I know one has said it like this, so feel free to correct me, but I feel like building community is a big part of sustaining intangible cultural heritage. And I think community is reflected in all of the chapters of this book, as I recall.
And it's finding the centers of community. Like Brian had a good question about some of the ideas that are informing the book. And I think revisiting some of the early writing in community studies and anthropology is very, very useful. So there's the idea that instead of just kind of looking at culture as an abstract entity and studying from that perspective, the community studies focus is much more human-centered. And one of the things that is related to that is how are communities formed around common interests and practices? So if you can go in there and find what's interesting and appealing, and maybe already in line with some of the interests that you have in sustainability or development, that's a really good start. I think that kind of community studies focus is at least influencing some of the ways that, well, I know it's influencing the ways I'm thinking about it, but I kind of see that focus kind of resonant with some of the other writing. And then recognizing full well the need to blend in a critical perspective on that, because you need a critical heritage studies that says, well, what's kind of the bigger effects and points to really begin to interrogate and question within something that looks at community heritage.
Right, it's one of those areas of academic focus where you need to be the field worker and the academic that's analyzing, right? You kind of have to do both. I want to read theories. So he asked, are there specific theories that inform or guide the book and help focus future ICH studies? You may have read that, but I wanted to make sure. Shihan and Mariana, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I've been trying to answer, but I've been typing really slowly, so I do apologize for this. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things, if you're going to look at the start of where ICH came from, you know, it's the Mondia Cult. I don't know if you've heard of it. The Mondia Cult Conference. It's now its anniversary this year. It was the first time. It's the World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development. And it was the first time that the notion of intangible heritage was used. And so from then onwards, this was in the 1980s, from then onwards, we have a huge array of writings and of theories that inform cultural heritage. I mean, Laura Jane Smith is a very big one in the field of heritage in general. Because she created a concept called the authorized heritage discourse, which is there are perceptions of heritage that are officially supported, which means there are perceptions of heritage that are not acknowledged. And this creates a huge tension. And if you look at a lot of communities, many of the expressions that they have, many of them are intangible, may or may not be recognized. And what do people do about it? You know, they will have reactions about it. They will deal with it in different ways. So there's everyone who studies that. Intangible heritage has had quite a branching out of different things, people who look more into performances itself and in how you create and craft things. So you have all of that. Then you have people who look a little bit more into cultural heritage policies and how intangibility has shaped them. So I mean, there's countless of really important authors out there, and if we could try and come up with a list of authors if people are interested, but I think for now I won't be able to list them all here, but I would definitely recommend starting with Mondia Cult and understanding what happened there. I would recommend the huge, I mean, it was a great challenging effort and it was successful, I would say, that intangible heritage experts fought to question the concept of authenticity, and that led to the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. So the NADA document on authenticity is one of the documents that led in the future to a perception of intangible heritage, and everything else. I mean, UNESCO has quite a lot of really good sources, but I've written 2 down here in the chat, which I think it's an interesting one. And then from there, if you go through the list of references, they will start repeating themselves at some point in terms of who the authors are. So you'll get a sense of who are the most important authors in this field if you follow these 2 authors and look at the reference list. So that will be my answer for now.
A good answer. A lot of times too, when we look at this, we want to get the idea, what is it that the heritage studies approach can offer to all this and how that ties into it. And Shihan and Mariana and I've kind of gotten into these kinds of discussions throughout the projects of what's going on here in the United States versus what you have over there across the pond. And I agree with your points about bringing the intangible cultural heritage into the discourse, and that has really taken off in the last 30 years or so. One of the little forerunners, I'm just curious if you're running into this at all in your scholarship in the UK, is the term cultural conservation, because that was showing up about the same time. And it seems to me that some of the idea of cultural conservation tying in with historic preservation is also very resonant with what was happening, and it sort of shifted into ICH. There was the idea in the 70s and 80s, especially, that historic preservation shouldn't just be the bricks and mortars, and they began to bring the human development into the rubric of cultural conservation. And Mary Hufford's writing on that, I think, is really pretty important. And Norman Lomas was writing about it. But it seems like that got sort of shifted away, and the ICH has become kind of the more resonant term now. So I'm not sure if there's a question there, but are you hearing the idea of cultural conservation and the discourse over in Europe there and in Asia?
I do think, I mean, I definitely agree that ICH is a beautiful product of theories that came out of the American scholarship and out of the European scholarship. Unfortunately, we see a huge drive coming in from African scholars and Asian scholars, which is great. But interestingly, in this side, I would say that cultural conservation still tends to be a little bit more guided or prone to follow material heritage perceptions, although I have to say I really do not agree with the distinction between tangible and intangible, so I am perpetuating it here, but I really do not want to. Yeah. I don't think there should be a distinction at all. I think everything is enmeshed in the same negotiation exercises that we do every day. But I do find it important that we all realize there is unfortunately a little bit of a distancing between what happens in America and what happens in Europe. And I think we really need to start bringing a lot of these concepts together, but also be very accommodating to perceptions that sometimes we notice in Asia and in Africa collide with these more dominating theories in heritage studies that emanate from American scholars and from European scholars. And when I say American scholars, I mean North America, because South American scholars are doing amazing work. And again, sometimes it's not very easy to see them having a strong voice. We are now, fortunately, but I think we do have to make an effort to bring in a diverse range of perceptions and voices into how we perceive and define heritage and how we work with it. But yeah, Gregory, I definitely abide by your contribution.
But one of the things that happened too is they kind of came up with a bit of a pun on cultural conservation, and they've made a cultural conversation. And that sort of contributes to these dialogic views of heritage, which I really like. I think that heritage discourse and dialogue is just really a very useful way of looking at all these kinds of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we need to bring all the voices in too, like you say, is that, some of the assumptions we have here is in the United States need to recognize that they aren't as global as we think they are. Their best intentions, or maybe worst intentions, I don't know.
Yes. Yes. No, but thank you for the comment. That sparked this conversation, Brian. Over to you, Gregory.
Oh, for Lauren.
So does anybody have any other questions that you want to ask before we wind down?
Lauren mentioned that building community is a big part of maintaining heritage, but I guess you could turn it around as well. Maintaining heritage brings communities, people together and maintain. I mean, this is what I'm finding in the Portuguese descendants of Sri Lanka with their music and dance and language, rudiments of the Creole language. Yeah. So it works both ways.
Yeah, that reciprocal.
I love that. That's a really good point. Thank you. Yeah. So before if nobody else has anything, I would like to just say, Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts is the state folk arts program for Arkansas. And we're, our main tenets are to present, sustain, and oh, I've lost my, Virginia, you have to help me.
Document, present, and sustain.
In alphabetical order, I should know. Document, present, and sustain folk and traditional arts across the state. Dr. Hansen has been an incredibly important consultant for our program and continues to be one of our biggest supporters. So I want to give him a quick shout out because he has been very helpful for us. So with that said, thank you all so much for attending and for presenting today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's been great.
Thanks for inviting us. And I want to say I really appreciate the great work that you guys are doing in Arkansas. When we were thinking of how to revamp and put it together, it's really successful. And I think it succeeds in relationship to your creativity, but also the awareness of the importance of community and engagement in these kinds of things, that it can be put into practice. It's happening, you know, it's not just a new idea, that we're kind of building from the strengths and the things out there and just figuring out a common way of talking about it to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. So thank you guys so much. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank